stability of capitalism. We'll offload that from you onto all these African American people. And then the worst part, having done that, with generation after generation, you kind of tell white people it's not because of capitalism that African Americans are treated so badly. It's because of something wrong with them. You blame the victim. Capitalism makes a victim, and then when you victimize that person, in this case African Americans, you then blame them. It's like having a person who is sexually aggressive with a female and then saying, no, the female wasn't dressed in the proper way, to somehow excuse or blame her for what is the improper behavior of the aggressor in that situation.
We're listening to Professor Rick Wolff. He's the author most recently of The Sickness in the System. And he's talking about the sickness of this system, the economic, the capitalist system that we're living under. It's a book that you can have along with a recent lecture by the professor for a contribution, a tax-deductible contribution to WBAI of $100. You can call our call center, 516-620-3602, to get this book, The Sickness in the System by Professor Wolff. 50 lectures in it, all kinds of topics that you're going to be interested in, plainly explained. Nothing that's too complicated for anyone, because the way that you do this book is to put it in simple terms that we can understand. 516-620-3602 is the number to call to get a copy of The Sickness in the System, $100 contribution to WBAI, 516-620-3602. If we could have a couple of people calling in right now, it would be most appreciated. And also, if you can become a WBAI buddy to Economic Update. Professor, when we did this once before, a while ago, we had quite a few people calling in and becoming buddies, and we would like to see that once again. You can call 516-620-3602 and say that you want to become a sustaining member, a WBAI buddy. And I would like to open up our listener phone line also to be able to have people speak with the professor. That number is 212-209, 212-209-28. Is it, Michael, you want to come in and tell me what the number is? I can't believe I blanked on it.
Sure thing, Linda. I'll be happy to. 2877.
All right, 2877 is the number. Thank you, Michael. 212-209-2877. To talk to the professor. Now, Rick, you say that the crash and this pandemic has reawakened people to social problems that capitalism can't solve. And that's what you think. You think that the fact that we're in the streets, that we are concerned now about workers, and we have more whistleblowers. You heard about the nurse who just came forward about the hysterectomies that were being done in an ICE detention center. More and more people are coming forward and are undaunted in their search for equality today. Now, talk about that. Talk about the developments that you see now in culture and people rising up.
I think what I'm seeing, and what I would urge others to become aware of, is a massive and extremely important shift in the consciousness or the culture. In other words, over the last 50 years, and of course I'm exaggerating a bit to make the point, over the last 50 years, when people identified a problem, whether it was racism or sexism or the degradation of our natural environment or whatever it was, they tended to go to work on that particular problem and to focus themselves on that particular problem. And they shied away from saying that it wasn't just this particular problem, but that the whole system was the difficulty that had to be addressed. They shied away because that was a legacy of the Cold War. They were afraid of being called disloyal or Reds or whatever it was. And that hobbled the opportunity for the different movements to work together. It hobbled the opportunity for people to be connected to one another and want a change of the system that could and would address all of their concerns. They didn't have the unity without which the change we need to have won't come. And I see that changing everywhere. When the Black Lives Matter folks begin to talk about capitalism, that's a broadening, wonderful broadening of sharing and bringing diverse people together. When you see folks understanding the link that the same government that is burning, literally burning up the West Coast, is the same government that is abusing immigrants, is the same government that is unprepared to protect the public health. You're beginning to see the linkages. And when that happens, and when the people who are victims and critics of the system are able to say so, and to be able to be welcomed in the movements for change, then you're beginning to get that assembling of people that makes a system actually be changed. And that's what we need, and it is very heartening to see the movements in that direction.
And in the last part of your book, you consider the possibilities for changing the system as a whole. So it's not all depressing.
Not at all. I think I'm optimistic. I think that yes, it's dark these days. I don't want to deny it. Mm-hmm. We have a government that is literally out of control. That is, in a way, some of the worst right-wing mentality that we always knew was there, but never expected to be in a position of power. I don't want to deny any of that, but it is having the effect of teaching and provoking masses of people into understanding and into action. And that's part of what is going on. There's a complicated linkage as the system falls apart, as the middle of the political spectrum, whether it's the Bush family or the Clinton family and all that they represent, as the people leave loyalty to that kind of politics that brought us to this mess. Yes, some of them go to the extreme right, but a growing number are going to the left. That's what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez represents, what Bernie represented. There's more and more movement. No one thought these people would have the echo in the American population they have shown that they have. That's not going to go away. So yes, I am optimistic, and the book tries to identify what the signs are of a movement adequate to this moment in a declining capitalist empire.
We're speaking with Professor Rick Wolff, author most recently of The Sickness in the System. Professor, before we move on to WBAI listener calls at 209-2877, can you talk a little bit about the distractions that were put forth by the government, distractions that were put in place just to serve as a cover for those who were really benefiting and getting relief, such as that $600 a week that was being given to people who lost their jobs and then taken away, and other reforms and benefits that were given and then taken away while something else was going on underneath. Can you explain?
Sure. The best way to explain about the unemployment is to say two things were going on. Number one, there was a terrible fear in the ranks of the people who run this country, the CEOs, the big corporations, that the pandemic combined with the capitalist crash, the worst of the three we've had this century, that started in February, that there would be the decision by private employers faced with the pandemic, faced with the crash, to lay off large numbers of people, which they did. More than 55 million Americans since the last week of March have had to file for unemployment compensation. Now, some of them are back to work, but we still have tens of millions that are out of work. Let me drive home to all of the listeners to this program. They were given an extra $600 because of the fear that putting that many people out of work and asking them to survive on the pittance that most unemployed people get would have been to create a massive backlash that threatened the whole system. That's another
revolution.
sign.
Yes, right.
Yeah, it's another sign. But here's a way to understand it. In Germany, the unemployment went from 5% in March to 6%, which it is today. In Germany, and by the way, in France, in Italy, in other countries, they didn't dare throw millions of people out of work. And the reason they didn't in those capitalist countries is that their working class is organized. They have strong unions, they have strong socialist, communist, and anti-capitalist political parties. And if they had dared to throw millions of people out of work, those millions of people would have gone into the streets in those countries, and those countries would have come to a much sharper stop than the pandemic had ever achieved for them. And so they didn't dare. And it's a sign of what the work is that we have to do in America, that in this country they did dare, but they realized how dangerous the risk was that they were taking. So what they did was give that $600, but they're terribly afraid that that money, which is driving the government into deep debt, given how much it is giving to corporations, it's borrowing like we've never seen before in peacetime. The government under Mr. Trump, the biggest deficits we've ever had by these so-called conservative Republicans, they're terribly afraid that as the debts of the government go up, and as we all understand that our taxes are simply paying the interest to the rich who lent to the government, that there's going to be trouble. And they don't want that deficit to be big. They don't want the government to be pressed by the people to go and get them to pay the taxes, finally, that they've never paid, the rich and the corporations, because of the debts. So they want to scale down the debts. And, of course, they don't want to do that by depriving themselves of government support. So they want to cut the 600 back to 300. It's an unspeakable abuse of the mass of people. But it is the kind of debate that distracts people. That's the irony of it, from the fact that it's the system that's the problem. We're supposed to prefer Mr. Biden, who'll give them $400 or $500, rather than Mr. Trump, who'll give unemployed people $300. This is an absurd discussion because they never should have been put unemployed in the first place, just as the Europeans refused to do. So it's kind of distracting everybody into a detail to try to save the system from the justified anger of the mass of people that they're treated this way in the first place.
But yet the banks and corporations have been getting relief behind the back of
Huge.
this.
I mean,
yes.
This is a terribly important thing, Linda, that you bring up. And give me a moment to explain. 1/3 of all mortgages in the United States right now, as I'm speaking to you, 1/3 of all mortgages are owned by the Federal Reserve. That's a government agency in this country. It's our central bank. If Mr. and Mrs. Smith go to the corner bank and borrow money to buy a home, and they get a mortgage, that bank immediately sells that mortgage. Minutes after Mr. and Mrs. Smith have signed it, that bank sells it to the Federal Reserve and gets money for it. You know who owns the mortgage? You know who the real lender is for 1/3 of all American houses? It's the government. The government is the creditor. The government is pumping the money in that makes it possible for people to borrow, and by doing that drops the interest rate so that people can afford the very possibility of buying a home. We don't have a private housing economy in this country. We have a publicly funded one. There's a massive program of welfare for homeowners. Let me give you a second example. The Federal Reserve is now buying corporate bonds by the billions. What does that mean? Any company in America that's having a problem, it produced something that nobody wants. Its technology is outmoded. Its workers are angry and demanding higher wages. How does it solve this problem? The quickest, easiest, cheapest way right now is to go to the Federal Reserve, go to the government, borrow limitless amounts of money at an interest rate barely above zero. Cheap, free, or nearly free money. And every corporation in the country is doing it. You know who's lending them the money? The Federal Reserve, the government. So here's a simple way to understand it. private capitalist center of this economy is now receiving government welfare. It's receiving way more welfare than a single mom with 3 kids ever got. And that's why you don't hear the usual conservative noise against welfare folks, because the welfare now is the capitalist system, the welfare recipient. It's all on government life support, and that's another sign of a system falling apart.
This is listener-sponsored WBAI in New York. You're listening to Professor Rick Wolff. We're talking about his new book. His new book is called The Sickness in the System. It's called The Sickness in the System, and then there's a colon. What's the rest of the title, Professor?
The rest of the title is When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself.
And the number to call to become a member of WBAI is 516-620-3602. Thank you, those of you who are calling in. And we're going to take some listener phone calls right now to, if you want to speak to Professor Wolff. And I know we do have some callers waiting. So WBAI, you're on the air. Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
My name is Asar. I'm from Harlem.
Oh, hi.
And
How are you doing?
it's 2 questions I would like to ask Professor Wolff. First of all, it's an honor and pleasure to actually address the question to him. And the question is, the Republican Party, is the Republican Party and the Democratic Party are actually 2 classes fighting each other? And to refine it more, when you look at a coin, but it's like when we were children, we would say heads you win and tails you lose. No matter which party you go for, you're going to lose. That's any found that. The second question is the Alexander Cortez and Bernie Sanders. Do they really believe that change is going to come in this country through parliamentary change, or it's going to be an armed struggle? I'm going to hang up, and hopefully I made my question or commentary something that the professor can pick off of and expound on. I appreciate
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks for calling in, Asaf.
Yeah.
Professor.
Yes, let me respond in 2 parts to the question, and to thank Assad for his kind words about my work. I appreciate them enormously, and I don't want in any way, by jumping into the substance of his question, not to acknowledge his kind words. Okay, having said that, I could not agree more. I think that the Republican and Democratic parties are now, and probably have been for quite a while, people gathered together who support the reproduction of capitalism. That's what they do. They don't agree exactly on how to do it, on exactly what kind of capitalism they want to see established. The Republicans are generally more pro-business, and they're more comfortable with a harsher kind of capitalism, and the Democrats are a little bit interested in a softer kind, at least domestically. They are almost identical when it comes to foreign policies. So yes, these are parties that have long ago become dependent on the donations of corporations and the rich. Most big corporations, if you look closely, give money to both parties. They're covering their bets. They know that it really doesn't matter for them which party gets in. As long as they've given money to both of them, they will have their interests served. What that means is that the mass of people don't have a political party, that those who are victims of capitalism have no place to go to express the fact that they would like to be served by a system that was different, that wasn't geared to reproducing capitalism, to saving the capitalist first and let everybody else, struggle on their own. What we don't have in the United States are political parties that are committed to a different system, where you could vote for them and get a different system that gave working people the priority rather than capitalists, that gave the solution of problems like systemic racism, the misogyny we suffer from in this country, that make those the priority problems and really address them for the first time, guarantee people the income, the job, the education that would make it possible for us to really have equality and freedom. We need a political party that does that. I don't see it being the Democrats or the Republicans. They don't look willing to go in that direction. There are some Democrats who do. So maybe the way it'll happen in this country, which is what happened in other countries, is that a new political party emerges. The old Democratic Party splits, and part of it joins with the new one, and then you have a real alternative. If I could be a little bit, I don't know, critical of, in a funny kind of way, I'd try it this way. I've always found it amazing that Americans talk a lot about wanting freedom of choice. When you go to the supermarket, you want 27 kinds of breakfast cereal that you can choose among, or 26 kinds of toothpaste in the drugstore that you can choose among. You want choice. And yet, when it comes to political parties, you seem to be a country happy with two that are barely identifiable as different. What happened to the desire for freedom of choice? Why not have a political system that lets political parties proliferate, let there be bunches of them, let them be really struggling with one another to win our votes by advocating for the kinds of changes more and more Americans know they need. On the last point, violence. I'm not in favor of violence. I want the change to be peaceful, and that's what I would prefer. But I am also not naive. I don't see the existing system in this country being willing peacefully to go away, to change, to understand that its time is over. Look at the reaction of Mr. Trump and the GOP to perfectly peaceful protesters. It's full of threats of violence, full of threats that the police will be supported in ways that are violent. My fear is that the system won't go quietly. It will choose to be violent, and I don't want to be victimized by having not thought about that, and therefore leave the field to them. It's self-defense, but it has to be understood as part of what this system wants to do as it faces the decline that it keeps wanting to pretend it's not in the middle of.
You're listening to Professor Rick Wolff. He's the author most recently of The Sickness is the System. The book is divided into 50 commentaries. They are reminders of how the U.S. political economy has failed us so miserably and exacerbated the COVID-19 crisis. Lectures and writings by the professor. He's host of Economic Update here on WBAI every Wednesday at 6:30 following the WBAI Evening News. Thank you to Gene